Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, their playoff run fell short to the Celtics in the NBA Finals. The two combined for 1,122 points in these playoffs, which is the most by any guard duo in NBA history. But our friend Chris Canty still has questions about the Mavericks leader.
We never question Dirk Nowitzki's work ethic. We never question his commitment to trying to improve his body and his game in order to contend in the championship rounds. We're questioning all of those things with Luka, and those aren't recent questions if you listen to Brian Windhorst and others that have covered him since he was playing pro ball in Europe. These are things that have been coming up. These were never questions for Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown. And that's why I don't know that Luka Doncic is going to be able to win a championship as the leader on a team.
It's an interesting take. And so let me, I can see the skepticism in Dominique Foxworth's. Well, I can't not address that. Go ahead. Before I ask you, D, a series of questions, why are you making that face at me, Neek?
I mean, we did question. Dirk was like considered soft before he actually won the championship. Like, I certainly don't want to get in the way of Udonis's take on this, but that seems, one thing I know for sure is that Luka can win a championship. It kind of seems like a bit of an absurd take. I'm sorry to my man Chris Canty, but obviously you can win a championship with Luka as your best player.
Here's what's being questioned, though. So let's, whether we agree or disagree with Chris for the purposes of this conversation, what's being questioned is whether he is in the absolute tip-top physical condition that a player can be in, that he is, and that some people will suggest that goes to motivation, that it goes to total dedication and discipline and all that. Is that fair?
No, he's 25 years old.
25 years old.
He's 25 years old.
Okay.
You don't know what you don't know. Right now, to this point, everything has come easily to Luka. We see him averaging 30, and we see him almost doing a triple-double. He's leading his team in the playoffs in rebounds, assists, and scoring. He's the only person to ever do that in the playoffs, to lead the whole playoffs in rebounds, assists, and scoring. So we're witnessing greatness, and he's not in his best shape. He has to be challenged. Nobody has challenged Luka yet off the basketball court, working on his championship habits. This is where Jason Kidd comes into play. This is where that championship habit that Jason Kidd has, playing the Olympics, these are the things that Luka needs to work on. Not the basketball things that most 25-year-old guys need to go in the gym and lock themselves in the gym. Luka needs to lock himself outside the gym and work on his habits and his skill set.
You were making some interesting points to me in our conversation before the show today. You've seen that with other players, other young players whose games were spectacular, but those were things they needed to work on. Who were you thinking?
Well, you talk about LeBron James when we played and we lost to Dallas in the finals, and we want to talk about 2010 when that team first came together, and then we didn't get it done. LeBron had to do some soul searching this summer. He had to focus on some different things and do some different things that he didn't have to do. LeBron James never wanted to play in the post. He had to get in the gym, and he had to get in the lab with Akeem Olajuwon. He came back and he played in the post. And we played a lot out of the post with LeBron in that era. So that was something that he had to do that he was not accustomed to doing, and Spo challenged him to do that. So we focus on things like that, and we talk about things like that. Jason Tatum didn't get it done in 2022. We talk about his maturity and the way he's grown as a basketball player. For us, the Miami Heat, frustrate him, get in him, make it about everything but basketball. Get Jason Tatum to complain to the referees more than he's focusing on the game. He is not that player anymore. He has graduated. He has passed that test. You can't frustrate Jason Tatum to the point anymore where he's focused more on the refs in the basketball game. So you have to go through these processes and these steps. I think this is just a process and a step for Luka. He will be better. He has to accept the challenge coming from his coaches.
Well, that's well said, but you bring up the best point, because the stuff with the refs is probably the single biggest complaint that I've heard from people about Luka. And in fact, Wendy, Chris Canty referenced the conversation he had with Wendy. Wendy went through a whole litany of times. We've seen that from Luka in big international games, playing for Slovenia, stuff that is as important to him as the NBA is. So that does feel like another legitimate area for criticism and maybe necessity for growth.
And it cost them points in Game 3 of the Finals, which is the one he ended up fouling out in a series in which they had no margin for error as the underdog. And look, UD talked about challenging him. They've talked to him about complaining to the refs 1,000 times in Dallas. They've talked about his conditioning, I'm sure, 1,000 times in Dallas. He can get better at those things. He will get better at those things. He's not the first player that's had to get better at them. We don't want to be having these conversations about him when he's 30, 31, 32 and be like, are we still talking about this? And there's been players that are in the league today and out of the league today that's been the case. But any discussion about Luka and what he is and what he isn't should start with these two things. They are nowhere without him. They are not in the finals without him. They are not in the conference finals without him. He is an MVP candidate every single year, every single season. And he is maybe the single most feared player in the league to game plan against, and that includes the Celtics. When you talk to Celtics coaches in the finals about this, man, we can't wait to get done with this dude. If we can just wrap this up, this dude is scary.
Right, that's fair. All those things are true. But you used an expression a minute ago, to whom much is given, much is expected. He's as gifted, Luka Doncic is as gifted an offensive player as we've probably ever seen in the history of the league. I don't think that's an exaggeration. So the question is, who can talk to him? I'm thinking of a story Charles Barkley once told on my old radio show on Mike and Mike, that when he first came into the league, Charles was having great success and all that stuff, and Moses Malone, in a locker room, like practically I don't want to, misstate this, practically backed him into a locker and said to him, "You're not in shape. You're not in the shape you need to be in to be the best player you can be, and that's what we need you to be." And Charles said it changed his entire career because Moses was someone he'd listened to. Who will Luka listen to?
Got to be Kyrie. It's got to be Kyrie. When you talk about a guy who's connected that locker room, you talk about a guy who's won a championship, who's been there before, who's been around a more prepared, more focused athletes ever in LeBron James, who understands how conditioning and preparation can take your game to the next level. That's got to be a conversation for Kyrie Irving. He's got to be the guy to have that conversation, and I think Luka respects him. I go back to the conversation after they beat the Clippers. That's my hermano. That's my brother. Mm-hmm. You talk about brother and you talk about brotherhood. Your brother can have those uncomfortable conversations with you, and you got to respect that.
But let me go back to Neek. Neek, if we thought the first criticism was a little too much, is this part of it fair?
I mean, I think Luka lost in the finals because the Celtics were an all-time great team. Like, there was no level of defense that Luka was going to play or no level of physical conditioning that was going to change the outcome of that game. That doesn't mean that he doesn't need to address that. And I think the person that he needs to listen to is probably going to be himself. And you kind of have to learn through experience. And we've seen this happen time and time again in NBA history. A player or a team gets deep into the final or gets deep into the playoffs or maybe even the finals, and then they get embarrassed. And then they go off to the lab, like UD was saying, they come back stronger. So I think that this ass whooping that he just took was kind of part of the process that we see for a lot of champions. And it probably is going to lead to him being open to some criticism when he probably hasn't been open to that in the past because he's never come up against it. But we all have to remember that this team, before the playoffs, nobody was picking them. I think to Zach's point, like, they've gotten so far. Let's not get ahead of our skis and criticizing Luka. Like, this team is incredible because of Luka. Does that mean he can't get any better? No, but it does mean that if they're going to get over the hump, it's not going to be because of Luka's defense. It's going to be because they get better around Luka, honestly.
Well, and to Neek's point, like, yeah, we can call it an ass whooping and say it was Luka got his ass whooping and all this. Who else on the Mavericks had like an A or even a B series in the finals against the Celtics? Who else was like carrying the Mavericks? I don't know. Who else?
That's fair. Obviously, none of them were. The Celtics were the better team from jump. That said, and Wendy said it yesterday, sitting right here, we will never know what would have happened if Luka doesn't foul out of Game 3, a game in which he kind of, people use the word tapped out. I don't mean that in a literal sense. No. But some of those frustration fouls he picked up, which led to that stuff, were the reason that he winds up fouling out for. I mean, it's inexcusable that a player of his caliber should foul out of a game when your season is on the line with 4 minutes left in regulation in what was a very winnable game at that moment. And if they did win that game, look, we'll never know how differently Game 4 might have played out, but we might have been sitting there at a 2-2 series. So things could have been. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that was possible.
No, I agree 1,000%. That last foul, that sixth foul, you do not try to take a charge 25 feet away from the basket when you're the best player on the team.
20 seconds after he got his fifth foul.
That is deflating, and I will say one thing about this. When your best player is a defensive liability and the other 4 guys are watching that and he is not giving the maximum effort, that is deflating to your guys, that is deflating to your locker room. Once again, to whom much is given, much is required.
People will suggest that one of the reasons he doesn't give as much effort on the defensive end is because his usage is so high on offense that he needs to conserve energy. Is that fair? No, you're not.
I don't agree with that. That wasn't an excuse for Kobe. That wasn't an excuse for MJ and all the greats. And the guys we're starting to put him in these conversations with, if we're going to speak on you on this level and these conversations with these guys, then you have to play at that level on both ends of the basketball court. You don't have to be the best defensive player on your team, but you have to give effort. And I think that's where the question was with Luka. Guys were asking, the locker room was asking, the coach was challenging him for more effort.
So what UD just said about it being demoralizing is the word you used, I think, if you're deflating. is something I've heard from so many players and coaches around the league in the last 10 to 12 years. If we're carrying you on defense every possession,
yes,
it gets deflating. And no one is asking him to be a first Drew Holiday or something.
right,
It's just,
exactly.
you just got to compete. You just got to show us that you're competing, because it gets hard for everyone around you to keep the spirits up. It's something you hear all the time. And I think Luka has that in him. He's shown he has that in him. And it's just the competition level's got to be there.
Conditioning. The conditioning is why he cannot sustain it. We saw flashes of it. We saw flashes in the Clipper series. We saw flashes in Game 4. But you cannot sustain a defensive mindset and play on both ends of the floor if you don't have proper conditioning. You got to be one of the best conditioned athletes in the world to be able to play both ends of the basketball court and to compete at a high level at least.
I think that's fair, and I don't have the stat in front of me, but there was a number that we'll all remember. His numbers in the first 3 quarters of games versus the fourth quarter of games. That could also come to conditioning, where his play would clearly fall off as these games got late, and maybe he's just not in the same level of shape that some of the other players are. All right, it's an interesting conversation. No one is questioning his he's a great player. Every team in the league would move heaven and earth to have him on their team, but it doesn't mean there isn't room for